The holiday roast was still steaming when my mother looked across the elegant Christmas table, swirled her wine, and smiled. "We finally closed on your grandmother's place last month," she announced to the room, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Then, she looked directly at me. "But then again, you were never in the will anyway, darling." My sister giggled into her silk napkin. Around the table, 11 pairs of eyes turned to watch me shatter. But I didn't. Because none of them knew that inside the leather purse resting against my chair was a certified deed to that exact farmhouse. And in about 90 seconds, the secret in that purse was going to turn this loud family dinner into the quietest room in the entire county. Welcome back to a place where ordinary women meet impossible families, and answer with quiet steel instead of screaming. If a story has ever made you set down your tea and whisper, "Good for her, you are exactly where you belong." My name is Clara. I'm 34, and I run an independent bookkeeping firm for the local farms scattered across our valley. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of how I ended up at that table holding a financial landmine. To understand how I got there, we have to go back 10 months. It was a freezing Tuesday in February, and I was deep into reconciling the winter ledgers for a local dairy farm when the call came. My grandmother, Hazel, had taken a sudden turn for the worse in the night. I was the one the hospital called. I was always the one who got called. Not my mother, who lived 20 minutes across town. Not my sister, Brooke, who lived even closer. Me. Because for 8 long years, I had been the one driving out to the old farmhouse on the ridge with her prescriptions, her tax forms, her weekly groceries, and a hot thermos of coffee for the quiet mornings. I closed my laptop, left a quick note on my office door, and drove out past the frozen, white fields. Hazel was propped up in her antique bed when I got there. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile against the pillows, but her eyes were as sharp as flint. She held my hand tightly for a while, not saying much. Then, she reached into the deep drawer of her nightstand and pressed a small, heavy iron key into my palm. It belonged to an old tin recipe box she'd kept on the kitchen mantel since before I was born. "When the time comes," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves, "you'll know where to look. Let the paper speak, Clara." I asked her what she meant. She just patted my hand gently and told me to drink my coffee before it went completely cold. I tucked the key deep into my coat pocket and didn't think much of it. I figured she was just exhausted, talking the soft way old people talk when the heavy winter medicines blur the edges of reality. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, but I wouldn't understand any of it until the house was already gone. That farmhouse was the only place I ever felt like I truly belonged. I grew up in town, in my parents' tidy, sterile ranch house where every single conversation felt like an annual performance review. But during the summers, I belonged entirely to Hazel. She taught me how to snap green beans on the porch swing and how to read a grain bill so the local co-op couldn't pad the numbers. She'd spread the farm's messy receipts across the wooden kitchen table and let me add up the columns out loud. "Numbers don't lie, Clara," she'd say. "People do. So you learn the numbers." That kitchen was exactly where I decided what I wanted to be. I opened my own bookkeeping office at 22 in a rented room above the hardware store. My parents wouldn't help with college because they thought the work was boring and beneath us, but Hazel quietly slipped me her egg money every month just to make sure I could pay the rent. While I was driving out to see her every single week, my mother came exactly twice a year, mostly to ask questions about the rising value of the land. Brooke only came for holidays and always left early to beat the traffic. I'm not telling you this to sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because of something Hazel said during the last good autumn we shared, sitting together in her garden with dark dirt under both our fingernails. She looked at the old house, then at me, and said it plain. "This place goes to the one who stayed." I just laughed it off. I told her not to talk like that she had years left. She didn't argue. She just smiled that knowing smile she always gave when she possessed a secret I hadn't figured out yet, and went right back to her tomatoes. I should have asked her what she meant. I didn't. I thought we had time. Hazel passed away in her sleep just 3 days after she gave me that iron key. The funeral was held on a gray, overcast Saturday, and I planned every single detail of it. I picked the traditional hymns she loved, ordered the flowers, wrote the obituary, and stood by the chapel doors thanking neighbors who had known her for 60 years. My mother, Sharon, wore expensive designer black and accepted condolences like a tragic queen receiving her subjects. My father stood beside her and said absolutely nothing, which was his entire personality. Brooke spent the reception hidden in a corner on her phone. I noticed, because you notice things when grief makes everything too loud and too quiet at the same time. What I remember most about that afternoon isn't the sadness. It's the math. At the reception, before the funeral casseroles were even cold, my mother leaned over and whispered to ask what I thought the acreage would fetch on the open market. I thought I'd misheard her. Then I saw Brooke drifting through the quiet rooms with her phone camera out, photographing the walnut hutch, the handmade quilts, and the grandfather clock, narrating estimated prices under her breath like a vulture at an estate sale. "That clock is worth thousands," she murmured. "And the land, Mom. The land is the real payday." Nobody asked who would feed Hazel's old barn cat. Nobody asked where her garden tools should go. They only asked what her life was worth in cash. I stood in my grandmother's empty kitchen, right by the tin box she'd told me about, and felt something cold settle deep in my chest. I told myself it was just grief. I told myself families get strange around death, that they didn't mean it the way it sounded. I thought the hardest part was already behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part hadn't even started. It began with a phone call about a will in April. My cousin Jude called a sudden family meeting. Jude is from my mother's side, a shady, part-time notary who runs a tax and title shop 2 towns over and always smells faintly of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. The meeting wasn't at a professional lawyer's office. It was held at my parents' kitchen table over a coffee cake and a manila folder. That should have been my very first clue. Jude put on his reading glasses and announced that Hazel had left absolutely everything, the house, the land, the bank accounts, exclusively to my mother. To my beautiful daughter-in-law, he read from the document, who cared for me so deeply in my final years. My mother dabbed a dry eye with a tissue. Brooke squeezed her hand in triumph. My name was completely absent from the document. Not as a beneficiary, not as a witness, not even as a footnote. "You were never in the will anyway, honey," my mother said, and there was the faintest, cruelest little curl at the corner of her mouth. I sat very still. I am exceptionally good at sitting very still. But inside my mind, 2 things were screaming at me. The first was that the phrase, beautiful daughter-in-law, was an expression Hazel would have rather choked on than written. She and my mother had circled each other like territorial cats for 30 years. The second was the signature. I'd seen my grandmother sign 100 documents over the years. This signature was impossibly careful, perfectly steady. The Hazel I had buried couldn't even hold a soup spoon during her final weeks, let alone sign her name with flawless precision. And the date typed at the bottom? Just 3 weeks before she passed away. I didn't say a single word out loud. I thanked Jude for his time, took a slice of coffee cake I had no intention of eating, and drove back to my office with steady hands on the wheel and my mind doing fast arithmetic. Here is the thing about being the family bookkeeper. People always assume you only count what they choose to hand you. They completely forget that you also notice exactly what's missing. That night, I sat at my desk and laid out everything I knew, the way Hazel had taught me to lay out a ledger. 2 years earlier, I had personally driven her to an attorney's office in the county seat. She had told me she was getting her affairs in order and made me wait patiently in the lobby, which was very like her. She came out an hour later with a sealed envelope and a business card that she tucked safely into her purse. I never saw the finished documents, but I knew they existed. So, how did a will drafted by a real estate attorney 2 years ago suddenly turn into a completely different will notarized by Jude in a kitchen 3 weeks before her death? Wills can be updated, sure, but Hazel hadn't left that farmhouse in 6 months. She couldn't have driven to Jude's office, and Jude hadn't set foot on the property. I would have known. I called him the next morning and asked plainly when exactly Grandma had signed this new document. He snorted and got vague incredibly fast. Oh, she had me come by, Clara, he stammered. Last-minute change of heart. Happens all the time in this business. I asked who witnessed it. He said he'd have to check his physical files and get back to me. A notary who has to check whether anyone actually witnessed a major will is a notary telling you everything you need to know. I thanked him calmly and hung up. Then I sat there for a long time, looking at the corner of my desk where I keep the things I can't bring myself to throw away. And I remembered the business card. 2 years ago in that lobby, Hazel had pressed a card into my hand just in case. I had filed it without a second thought. Margaret Howerin, Estate Law. Before I called the lawyer, I tried to do the reasonable thing. I asked my own family for the truth. I drove over to my parents' house and asked to see the actual probate filing, the official court document, not Jude's coffee cake folder. My mother's entire face shifted. Why on earth would you need to see that? She snapped. I told her I just wanted to read it. I keep books for a living, reading documents is what I do. That's when she immediately reached for the emotional weapon she'd used against me my entire life. She made herself the victim. I cannot believe you, she said, her voice wobbling with rehearsed tears. Your poor grandmother is barely in the ground, and you're already clawing and fighting over her money. Brooke appeared in the doorway right on cue, folding her arms. Don't make this ugly, Clara. It's so like you to try and make everything all about yourself. My father suddenly found the floral wallpaper incredibly interesting. I looked at the three of them and finally understood something I should have realized years ago. They weren't confused. They weren't grieving wrong. They had a coordinated plan. And that plan required me to be quiet, ashamed, and gone. So I went quiet, but not at all the way they wanted. I drove back to my office and I did not call my mother to apologize, because for once in my life, I had absolutely nothing to apologize for. They thought they'd handled me. They thought the bookish daughter would fold because she always folded, because keeping the peace had always been my designated job in the family. What they forgot is what I actually do to earn my living. I spend my days finding the numbers that somebody tried very hard to hide. I find them in the rounding errors. I find them in the dates that don't line up. And there was a massive date that didn't line up, sitting right in a will my cousin couldn't explain. So the next morning, I picked up the phone and called Margaret Howerin. Margaret's assistant put me through the absolute moment I said my grandmother's name. That alone told me something crucial before the lawyer even spoke. But Margaret was careful on the phone, the way excellent lawyers always are, and asked me to come in person and bring my identification. We set the meeting for the following week. In the meantime, I did what I always do when I'm scared. I gathered cold, hard facts. I learned that the estate sale was already moving fast. Too fast. My mother had petitioned the court as executor under an informal, uncontested probate, the kind that moves incredibly quick through the system when nobody stands up to object. A court reviews a will on its face value, it doesn't test a signature unless an heir officially contests it, and no heir had. The required legal notice to the family had been sent to an old mailing address I'd left years back, so it reached me late, right after the easy window to object had nearly closed. Margaret had never heard a word about Hazel's death because nobody is legally obligated to notify the attorney who drafted a previous will. On paper, Jude's document looked entirely clean. The probate had sailed right through on the strength of it. And now, a public notice had been issued stating that the farmhouse and all 10 acres of land would be sold to settle the estate. Sold to whoever showed up with the money. I drove out to the farmhouse that evening and parked at the end of the long gravel drive. The house sat perfectly still in the blue twilight dusk, Hazel's old porch swing still hanging slightly crooked the way it always had. I thought about complete strangers walking through those rooms. I thought about someone tearing out her beloved garden just to put in a swimming pool. And I made myself a firm promise right there in the cold. Whatever the law eventually said about that forged signature, it would take months or even a year to prove in court, and the house would be long gone by then. I couldn't stop the sale in time. But there was absolutely nothing stopping me from being the one who bought it. If you've ever watched something deeply precious slip toward people who never did a single thing to deserve it, you know exactly the kind of quiet that fell over me. It wasn't defeat. It was a cold, sharp decision. People always expect rage to look loud. Mine looked like a legal pad. The night I decided to buy the house, I sat at my kitchen table above the office and made a detailed list, because lists are how I process the world. Down one side, I wrote what I knew to be true. The will was almost certainly a fake. The sale was almost certainly going through anyway. My family was almost certainly already spending money they hadn't legally received yet. Down the other side, I wrote exactly what I could control. Not their behavior, not the speed of the county court, just my own strategic moves. Made cleanly, made legally, made in the exact right order. My mother's voice kept circling in my head like a bad song. You were never in the will anyway. I let it stay. I didn't push it away. I let it sit right there and turn into pure fuel. Because anger, you understand, is highly efficient when you learn how to aim it. Then I started reading. I read everything I could find about how estate properties get sold when an executor is desperate for quick cash. And I found the specific word that changed the entire game. Auction. The estate wasn't doing a quiet, private sale to a pre-selected buyer. To move it fast and prove financial fairness to the court, the land was headed to a public estate auction. Public. Meaning open to anyone with the funds and the absolute nerve to raise a paddle. My mother thought she was quietly selling her mother-in-law's house to some faceless real estate investor. She had absolutely no idea the auction floor would be open to me, too. I sat back and felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Not peace, exactly. Purpose. I had a number to find, a plan to build, and for the first time in months, I wasn't the one being handled. I was the one doing math nobody else even knew was happening. Margaret Howren's office smelled like old paper and expensive coffee. She was a trim, sharp woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a silver chain and a firm handshake that meant business. I placed my driver's license on her desk. She looked at it, then up at me, and something in her shoulders immediately eased. You look exactly like her, she said softly. Then she opened a file that was easily 2 inches thick. 2 years ago, she told me, my grandmother had come to her office, entirely deliberate and clear-headed, and drafted a final will. It was signed, witnessed by 2 of Margaret's own staff members, and notarized flawlessly. In it, Hazel left the farmhouse and the surrounding 10 acres entirely to me, to Clara, the one who stayed. Margaret read the words aloud, and I had to look out the window for a moment to keep from breaking down. The bank accounts were split evenly among the rest of the family, but the house was mine in black and white, executed the proper way. Then I told her about Jude's version. I told her about the perfectly steady signature on a dying woman, the suspicious date, and the kitchen table reading. Margaret's expression went entirely flat and professional, which is exactly how good lawyers look when they are absolutely furious. I drafted the operative will, she said coldly. Nobody ever contacted me about a revocation. A valid later will can technically supersede an earlier one, but it has to be valid. She tapped the thick folder with her pen. If your cousin's document is what you suspect, then the will currently in probate is heavily fraudulent, and every single thing done under it can be legally challenged. I asked the obvious question, where was the original signed copy of her real will? Margaret had a certified copy in her office file, but the executed original copy was something Hazel had insisted on keeping herself, stored safely in her private safe deposit box at the local bank. And access to that box, Margaret warned, would require the specific key and the proper documentation Hazel had set aside. A key. A box. I immediately felt the phantom weight of that cold iron key against my memory. The very next morning, I drove out to the farmhouse one last time before it officially changed hands. The estate liquidation company hadn't locked the main gates yet. I still had the spare key Hazel gave me years ago, the one to the back kitchen door that always stuck if you didn't lift the handle slightly. I let myself in, and the familiar smell hit me first. Lavender, old wood smoke, and her. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. I went straight to the kitchen, to the shelf above the stove where the tin recipe box had lived my entire life. I took the little key from my coat pocket, the one she'd pressed into my hand back in February, and slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. Inside, tucked right under a stack of old index cards stained with decades of gravy and pie crust, I found two things. The first was a flat brass key in a small envelope clearly marked in her neat handwriting, Cedar Hollow Bank, Box 114. The second was a tightly sealed letter. My name was written on the front in her looping, elegant cursive, just Clara. I stood in that empty kitchen holding both items, and my hands, which never shake, were trembling. I knew exactly what the brass key was for. The bank box, the original will, the exact document that could blow my family's entire story wide open. But the letter was different. The letter was her voice. And I wasn't quite ready to hear it yet. So, I did something that wasn't entirely rational. I took the bank key, slipped the sealed letter safely into my bag, and I carried it around with me for 3 whole days without opening it. Some truths, once you let them out into the air, you can never fold back up. I think part of me knew that whatever she'd written would ask something monumental of me, and I wanted to make sure I was strong enough to do it before I read what it was. While I worked up the absolute nerve to open that letter, I built the infrastructure that would let me fight. I formed a private company. Not because I wanted to be cloak and dagger, but because I desperately needed to bid on that house without my mother seeing my name on the roster and jacking up the price out of pure spite. So I did what plenty of smart buyers do, all of it completely above board. I registered a limited liability company called Ridgeview Holdings. On the public records and the auction sheets, only the company name would show. The law still required me to report myself as the true beneficial owner to the Federal Registry privately, which I did immediately because I do absolutely everything by the book. But my family, casually scanning the upcoming auction paperwork, would just see a random corporate company they'd never heard of. They'd never connect it to the quiet daughter they'd completely written off. Then came the harder part, the money. The farmhouse and the 10 acres had been officially appraised around $215,000. That is not a massive fortune in the big city, but it is a mountain of cash when you keep books above a hardware store. I had been incredibly careful with my finances for 12 years, though. I had real, solid savings built up in the business accounts. I had a small inheritance from my grandfather that I'd never touched because Hazel had specifically told me to save it for something that truly matters. And I qualified for a commercial mortgage in the company's name to cover the remaining balance. I sat with my own ledgers for 2 straight nights, stress testing every single number the exact way I'd never let a client overextend themselves. I could do it. Barely, but cleanly. And there was one more massive thing in my favor, one cold, calculated piece of arithmetic. My mother needed cash and she needed it fast, which meant she'd set the auction's reserve price incredibly low just to guarantee a quick, effortless sale. A low reserve is a wide-open door. I fully intended to walk right through it. Right in the middle of all that intense planning, Brooke called me out of the blue to gloat. She didn't think she was gloating, of course, she thought she was just sharing wonderful news. She just put down a massive non-refundable deposit on a brand new luxury SUV. Fully loaded, Clara, she gushed over the phone. 3rd row seating, leather interior, the absolute works. She was paying for it, she explained casually, out of her upcoming share of Grandma's estate. Money that hadn't even cleared the probate court yet. I asked mildly whether it was wise to spend that money before the real estate sale officially closed. And that's when she said it, breezy as anything, like it cost her absolutely nothing to drop. Oh, come on, Clara. If Grandma had actually left the place to you, you'd just waste it on that dusty little bookkeeping office anyway. There it was. The exact same sentence my mother had used at the will reading, just in a slightly different dress. You'd just waste it. As if the 8 long years I'd spent driving out to that farmhouse in the freezing snow were a total waste. As if keeping someone's books, and someone's lonely company, and someone's dignity completely intact at the very end of her life were absolutely nothing. I felt the powerful old urge rise up to defend myself, to list every single doctor's appointment and every tax form to make her understand. But I didn't. I'd finally learned that you never waste your time explaining your true worth to people who have already decided you don't possess any. So, I just said, we'll see. There was a heavy little pause on the line, like she expected more of a dramatic fight and didn't know what to do without one. Anyway, she huffed, and immediately changed the subject to the color of the car's upholstery. After we hung up, I sat with my tea going cold and I thought about the auction, which was now only 11 days away. I thought about Brooke signing her name for a luxury car with money that was about to become the most expensive mistake of her entire life. And for the very first time in months, I let myself smile about it just a little bit. Just in the quiet privacy of my own kitchen. The night before I met Margaret to finally open the bank box, I opened my grandmother's letter. I made a cup of hot tea I didn't drink, sat in the armchair by the window, and carefully slid my thumb under the heavy wax seal. Her familiar handwriting filled 2 full pages, steady where her last forged signature had been suspiciously steadier. She wrote exactly the way she talked. No wasted words, no dramatic fluff. She told me she knew. She knew my mother was deeply underwater financially. Knew all about the secret second mortgage on their house and the failed business ventures. Knew that the very moment she was gone, there would be greedy hands reaching for the farmhouse before the funeral flowers had even wilted. I've watched it coming for years, Clara, she wrote. Your mother loves money the way some people love whiskey, and she will tell herself absolutely any story just to get her hands on it. Then she told me exactly what she'd done to stop it. The reel was placed in the safe deposit box with Margaret's name attached to it. The house left entirely to me on purpose, in clear writing. And then came the line that I have read so many times now I could recite it flawlessly in my sleep. If they ever dare to tell you that you were never in my will, you put this letter flat on the table and you let the paper speak. Don't fight them with shouting, Clara. You were never any good at it and it isn't your true strength. Numbers are your strength. Quiet is your strength. The house goes to the one who stayed. That's you. It was always you. I sat there in the dark for a long time. Then the tears came. Not the pretty, delicate way people cry in Hollywood movies, but the ugly, hiccuping kind that only arrives when someone reaches out from beyond the grave and tells you they saw you all along. Then I wiped my face, carefully folded the letter back along its worn creases, and put it somewhere incredibly safe. Because now, I wasn't just buying back a piece of real estate. I was carrying out the last clear instruction of the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Let the paper speak. 2 days later, Margaret and I officially opened safe deposit box 114 at the bank. Hazel had thought of this exact part, too. Years earlier, she'd quietly added me to the box as a co-signer, my signature already on file with the bank branch, so the box never froze when she passed away, and I could open it cleanly without waiting on any slow probate court orders. The brass key was entirely mine to use. Inside the cold metal box was a slim blue folder, and inside that was the executed original copy of her real will, signatures and seals perfectly intact, witnessed and dated 2 years back. Margaret laid it directly beside a copy of Jude's forged version on the bank's little conference table, put on her reading glasses, and snorted. She didn't say much for a while. Then she started pointing out the massive discrepancies. The dates, the witness lines, which on Jude's copy named 2 random people no one in town could quite locate, and the signature itself, which Margaret called a careful, practiced imitation by someone who'd seen the real thing. She'd seen forged documents before, Margaret murmured, and amateurs almost always make the exact same mistake. They try far too hard to look perfect. A genuine signature from a sick, dying woman wobbles naturally. This one marches like a soldier. She explained the legal path forward in plain terms. We could immediately file a petition to reopen the probate, present the original valid will, and formally allege estate fraud. If the county court agreed, the fraudulent will would be thrown out entirely, and every single thing done under it could be legally challenged. But she warned me that the road was slow, months, maybe a year of brutal litigation, with my family fighting fiercely every single step of the way. And in the meantime, the public auction would happen exactly on schedule, and the house would be sold away. So, we fight on 2 fronts simultaneously, I said simply. She raised a sharp eyebrow. I told her my exact plan. Form the anonymous company, buy the farmhouse clean at the public auction so it was safely in my hands, then aggressively pursue the fraud case to make the rest of the criminal truth land exactly where it belonged. Margaret took off her reading glasses, looked at me for a long, silent moment, and almost smiled. Your grandmother, she said softly, would have liked that strategy very much. Then she picked up her pen, and we got straight to work. The auction was held on a bitter, freezing October morning in the basement of the county building, in a sterile meeting room filled with metal folding chairs and burnt coffee. I didn't go in person. That was the entire point of the strategy. Instead, I sent the one person who could bid without a single suspicious eyebrow going up, the calm, junior associate from Margaret's law office who was there to strictly represent Ridgeview Holdings LLC. With my absolute hard financial limit written on a white index card in his breast pocket, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot with my phone gripped tightly in my hand and my heart in my throat. I had watched my mother and Brooke walk into the building just minutes earlier, dressed up to the nines, already celebrating their victory. Margaret's associate texted me live updates from the floor. The bidding opened incredibly low, just like I'd predicted. The reserve had been set cheap by my mother just for a fast, guaranteed sale. Then, the price began to climb. A local farmer wanting the extra acreage, a real estate investor down from the city, and the quiet young man in the good suit who just kept nodding smoothly, raising the company's number, patient as a Tuesday morning. The price passed $200,000. It passed $220,000. My family, I learned later, was absolutely thrilled in the room. Every single raise meant more instant cash for them, and they had absolutely no idea who was driving the price up or why. At $235,000, the room went completely still. The heavy wooden gavel came crashing down. The farmhouse on the ridge officially belonged to Ridgeview Holdings LLC. My phone suddenly buzzed in my hand. Sold to your company. Congratulations, Miss Clara. I sat in that cold car, pressed both hands tightly over my mouth, and let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. My mother walked out of the county building a few minutes later, beaming from ear to ear, counting the imaginary money in her head, loudly complaining to Brooke about that pushy corporate company that bid us up so high. She passed within 30 feet of my parked car and never even looked over. She thought she'd won the ultimate prize. She thought she'd successfully sold her mother-in-law's house to a stranger for top dollar. She had absolutely no idea she just sold it right back to the granddaughter she swore was never in the will. The money moved through the bank accounts the fast way money always moves when desperate people are clawing to spend it. My mother took the lion's share of the payout, and I would find out later that almost every single dollar of it went straight to paying off the secret second mortgage and the massive credit card debts she'd been hiding from my father for years. Brooke finished paying off her luxury SUV and immediately booked an expensive tropical vacation. My father just took whatever small amount was handed to him and said thank you to absolutely no one. They divided up the financial proceeds at a lavish celebration dinner that I wasn't even invited to attend, which suited me perfectly fine, because every single dollar they passed across that white tablecloth was a dollar I had personally paid out. I sat in my quiet office above the hardware store the night the funds finally cleared the registry, and I laid the fresh, crisp deed out on my desk under the lamp. Ridgeview Holdings LLC, owner of record. The farmhouse and 10 acres. My company. My house. My grandmother's house, right back where it belonged, and not a single soul in my family knew. I want to be completely honest with you about something, because this is the exact part of the story that people always get wrong. I did not feel triumphant that night. I just felt incredibly tired, and I felt sad, and I felt a strange, deep tenderness for the brilliant woman who had raised me, who'd seen this entire storm coming from years away and armed me perfectly for it from beyond the grave. The true triumph would come later. That night was just perfectly quiet. I traced the official address on the deed with one finger and thought about the porch swing and the garden that had temporarily gone to weeds. They were spending my money to celebrate cutting me out of the family. And I let them. I let every single check clear the bank, and I let every single bottle of champagne get uncorked, because Christmas was rapidly approaching, and my mother, who could never resist a captive audience, was about to gather the entire family at one holiday table. I would bring a very specific hostess gift, 3 pieces of white paper. The invitation came in early December, and it surprised me. My mother called, sweet as sugar pie, to invite me to Christmas dinner. Not because she suddenly missed me, of course. I knew her far too well for that. She invited me for two very specific reasons, and I could hear both of them humming right under her cheerful tone. The first was pure theater. Nothing said, this family has moved on, there are absolutely no hard feelings here, quite like having the bookkeeper daughter sitting quietly at the holiday table. The second reason was sheer nerves. There had been a persistent whisper around town that a mysterious company had been asking heavy questions about the estate, formally requesting certified court records, and my mother wanted to make sure I wasn't stirring up a pot that might eventually splash back on her. So, she wrapped an emotional leash in tinsel and called it a holiday invitation. You'll come, won't you, Clara, she said smoothly. It's Christmas, after all. Let's just put all this past unpleasantness completely behind us. Then, because she simply couldn't help herself, because cruelty was a reflex she had never learned to suppress, she added a little reminder. And let's please not have any unnecessary drama about the house. You know, you were never in the will anyway, darling. Don't go ruining everyone's Christmas over it. I held the phone tight against my ear and looked out my office window at the bright Christmas lights strung over Main Street. I thought about Margaret's legal filing, completely drafted and ready to be served the very first business day after the holidays. I thought about the certified deed sitting in my desk drawer, and the letter tucked in my bag. And I thought to myself, you have absolutely no idea what you are inviting into your dining room. I'll be there, Mom, I said warmly. What can I bring? She told me just to bring myself. I told her I'd bring myself, and I truly meant it. And I also meant the slim leather folder that would be tucked neatly into my purse right beside the cranberry sauce. I told her yes, I'd bring something special to the table. All right. I'd be lying if I told you I didn't heavily wrestle with it beforehand. For a whole week, I went back and forth about exactly how to execute this, because how you win matters just as much as whether you win. I could have done it cleanly and entirely privately. I could have just let Margaret's fraud lawsuit land in January with absolutely no fanfare, served the legal papers through a professional process server, and never said a single word at the holiday dinner. Part of me, the part Hazel always called my good quiet, desperately wanted that. It felt far more dignified. But there was another harsh truth I had to be completely honest about. They had actively shamed me in public, at the will reading, at the funeral, at every single family holiday for years. They'd intentionally made me small in front of an audience. And they'd done it on purpose, because an audience makes the shame stick. The smirk only worked for them because other people were watching it happen. So maybe, I reasoned, the truth deserved the exact same room the lies had used. I pulled out Hazel's letter and read those words one more time. Don't fight them with shouting. Let the paper speak. And right there, I had my final answer in her own handwriting. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw wine, or make an undignified scene, or say any of the cruel things I'd practiced in the shower. I was going to sit at that table, calm as a frozen pond, set 3 documents down, and let them do all the talking. No raised voice, no insults, just facts laid out in perfect order, the exact way I lay out a financial ledger. That week, I signed the final authorization for Margaret to file the official petition to reopen the probate the first business day after Christmas. The massive legal machinery was completely set in motion. The dinner would just be the precise moment the family learned the truth from me face to face, instead of from a cold court server. I picked out exactly what I'd wear, something plain, something Hazel would have called sensible. The thing about a lie with more than one person involved in it is that the lie is only ever as strong as its most frightened member. And Jude was getting terrified. I heard about it secondhand first, then I saw it for myself. Word had officially reached him that a private entity had requested the full estate file from the county registry, including the specific probate documents and the exact will he'd notarized at the table. To a crooked notary, that is the unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking in a house he thought was completely empty. Jude had called my mother in an absolute panic. I know because I happened to stop by my parents' house on a quick pretext just 2 days before Christmas, dropping off a holiday poinsettia like a good, dutiful daughter, and I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low, sharp, and panicked. Stop calling this house, she hissed into the receiver. Nobody is investigating anything, Jude. You did your job. You got paid. Now act completely normal. She turned around and saw me standing near the hallway, and her face went instantly pale before she forced a bright, brittle smile. I just smiled right back, set the flowers down, and told her I'd see her on Christmas Day. When the afternoon arrived, the house smelled heavily of roasted meat and pine needles. The gravy was still steaming when my mother smiled at me across the table and dropped her final insult about the will. The 11 people at the table fell completely silent, waiting to see if I would finally break. I reached down, opened my purse, and pulled out the slim leather folder. I didn't say a word. I just opened it and laid 3 documents flat on the table, right next to my mother's wine glass. What on earth is this? She asked, her voice tight with instant defensiveness. It's a ledger, Mom, I said smoothly, my voice completely calm. The first page is the certified deed to Hazel's farmhouse. As you can see, it belongs entirely to Ridgeview Holdings LLC. The second page is the corporate filing showing that I am the sole owner and shareholder of that company. I bought the house at the auction with my own money. Every single dollar you and Brooke have been spending came directly from my accounts. My mother's eyes went wide as she scanned the paperwork. Brooke stopped chewing entirely. And the third page, I continued softly, is a certified copy of the real will Hazel signed 2 years ago in a lawyer's office, which leaves the entire property to me. The original is safely sitting in a bank box. The petition to reopen the probate and formally charge Jude with notary fraud is being filed first thing Monday morning. The court will be looking into exactly where the money from that forged will went. The color drained so completely from my mother's face it looked like she'd seen a ghost. Brooke choked loudly on her wine, coughing into her napkin, her eyes darting to her phone as if she could already see her luxury SUV being repossessed. My father just stared blankly at the papers, completely frozen. The silence in that dining room was absolute. It was the quietest room in the entire county. They had tried to use shame as a weapon in front of an audience, but the beautiful thing about numbers is that they don't possess feelings, and they absolutely never lie. Hazel was right. Quiet steel beats screaming every single time. If you believe that standing your ground in absolute silence is the ultimate power move, hit that subscribe button right now, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and join our family here. Until next time, stay strong.